Thank you very much, Richard, and I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future.
Let's get it carefully. Welcome to the channel. I'm your host, BitBoy, and today we are getting deep. If you want your political, financial, and historical IQs to increase, then you're going to watch this entire video. If you don't, well, then just hit the like button. Many people think the government policy is created by the politicians in Washington, but that's not really how it works. They do implement the laws through legislation, but the ideas that appear in our legislation and the positions that the politicians take are handed down by other organizations that focus specifically on crafting policy. These organizations are called think tanks, but they're also sometimes called policy institutes, which is a much more accurate term because they are literally creating government policy. This is basically where the politicians get their ideas from. Sometimes they'll see articles published by these think tanks and repeat what they read on the podium, or in other cases, they might just copy and paste a report from a think tank to use in their legislation. There are hundreds of these think tanks out there, but there are only a small handful of them that actually matter and have influence. Today, we're going to explore how these think tanks operate by taking a look at one of the oldest and most powerful of these organizations, the Council on Foreign Relations, or the CFR. This was the organization that Hillary was talking about in our opening clip. The one she said tells the politicians what they should be doing.
I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing.
Remember, it's in plain sight. The CFR was initially founded as a public organization in 1921, but its roots go back a few years prior to 1917, when President Woodrow Wilson formed a small group called the Inquiry. Sounds like a witch hunting trial. To figure out the country's strategy to maintain global dominance following World War I. In 1919, the British were brought into the fold, and the group changed its name to the Institute of International Affairs. In 1921, the group's name was changed again to the Council on Foreign Relations. But what's really interesting is that this name was being used for a secret meeting where bankers, politicians, and other powerful people were attending for many years. These were the people who essentially became the first class of the CFR. It's important to look at some of the people who were involved in these early days to get a better understanding of what their goals were. First, Woodrow Wilson himself was an agent for the bankers. Who would have thought? He was the president who was in office when the Federal Reserve and the income tax were both established, both of which were extremely unpopular at the time. It's almost like they do what they want, whether you think they should or not, as the majority. I can only imagine what kind of payoff he got, or even what kind of blackmail maybe they had over his head. But he was honored by the Federal Reserve, and his face was placed on the largest dollar bill denomination ever issued, the $100,000 bill. These bills were not intended for general public use. They were actually never circulated among the general public and are totally illegal to own. But hey, his face is there. They were initially used only for transactions between Federal Reserve banks and were issued in 1934 as a gold certificate. Now, they are no longer needed because of digital banking, but there are still some of them out there in museums. Many of the bankers who were involved with the creation of the Federal Reserve, well, they were also founding members of the CFR, with J.P. Morgan and Paul Warburg leading the charge. How about that? As the CFR was being established, Edward Mandell House and Walter Lippmann were some of President Wilson's closest advisors, and they both became founding members of the CFR. These two figures were both extremely influential in Washington at the time. Edward Mandell House came from an aristocratic family that made their fortune in the slave trade and pivoted into banking after the Civil War. Same people, huh? House was Wilson's connection to the bankers and the one doing the bidding of the bankers in D.C. Walter Don't Give Me No Lippmann, another instrumental founder of the CFR, was a master of propaganda. Lippmann used these terms himself. In his book, Public Opinion, Lippmann wrote that we have learned to call this propaganda. A group of men who can prevent independent access to the event, can arrange the news to suit their purpose in order to conduct a propaganda campaign. There must be some barrier between the public and the event. Access to the real environment must be limited, before anyone can create a pseudo environment he thinks wise or desirable. In other words, control the masses, keep them ignorant, and feed them fake news. Lippmann also coined the term manufacturing consent, which is now best known as the title of Noam Chomsky's most famous book. Once again, though, back when Lippmann was saying it, he thought that it was actually a good thing. Lippmann was interested in shaping public opinion in such a way that the general population could be easily forced into doing whatever was asked of them. Or in his words, manufacture consent. Lippmann's basic belief was this: most people are too dumb to have any real involvement in politics. Because if we actually allowed democracy, then people would push civilization backwards. This is basically just the same old story of the ruling class fearing that they will lose their power. But this was a very popular philosophy at the time, and propaganda was actually celebrated back then. It wasn't seen as a bad word in elite circles. After the word started to become unpopular after the Second World War, they started saying public relations instead. Now I'll dig a little bit deeper into this in a full video of the origins of modern propaganda, but for this topic, Lippmann's involvement in the CFR is important because the purpose of the organization is to shape the minds of the masses so they go along with what the establishment wants to manufacture consent for.
Manufacturing consent. What is that title meant to describe?
Well, the title is actually borrowed from a book by Walter Lippmann, written back around 1921, in which he described what he called the manufacture of consent as a revolution in the practice of democracy. What it amounts to is a technique of control. And he said this was useful and necessary because the common interests, the general concerns of all people, elude the public. The public just isn't up to dealing with them, and they have to be the domain of what he called a specialized class.
Two of the biggest financial donors to the CFR, as it was being established, were the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller family also provided the money for the CFR to establish its headquarters in New York City. Then John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s son, David Rockefeller, was a director of the CFR for many years and was the chairman of the board from 1970 to 1985. Why were these industrialists so concerned with these big geopolitical issues? Because that's where they got a lot of their cheap labor and resources. And they want to keep it that way, obviously. Much has been said about those fellers. They were involved in the banana wars that I covered in my video on corporations you can find up here. And they seem to be popping up everywhere in my research. Henry Ford's involvement seems innocent, if you don't know much about his history and some of his overseas adventures. And most people actually don't know these details. They told us all about Henry Ford in school, about how he developed the assembly line and made cars cheaper for the average person. They didn't tell us that he was a literal card-carrying Nazi. And that's actually an understatement because the Nazis gave him an award in 1938 in the midst of the Second World War. Ford was awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, not much different than the Grand Wizard of the KKK, the highest honor a foreigner could receive in Nazi Germany. This raises some interesting questions about his investments in a foreign policy institute at that time. He had business reasons for wanting to influence foreign policy too. Around the same time that he was giving donations to the CFR, he was working to set up a plantation in Brazil, just like many other U.S. corporations at the time who were setting up shop in South America. The plantation was called Fordlandia, and it was sold as a company town, similar to the ones that existed in the U.S. at the time. But it ended in disaster, with the workers revolting over harsh labor conditions and forcing Ford out of town. I'd drive a Ram anyways, I wouldn't care. The Council on Foreign Relations has now been around for over 100 years, and they've grown to have a massive influence over the policies that our politicians support and how the public thinks about those policies. 20 years ago, senior editor at the Washington Post, Richard Harwood, wrote that the CFR was the ruling class.
Ruling Class Journalists, written by Richard Harwood, describes the CFR membership as the ruling establishment in the United States. The Washington Post article boasted that news reporters who are CFR members do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy for the United States, they help make it.
Today, the CFR continues to hold that same level of influence, both the government, finance, and the media. A few years back, former Armor Major Todd Pierce said in an article that the CFR uses psychological suggestiveness to create a false narrative of danger from some foreign entity, with the objective being to create paranoia within the U.S. population that it is under imminent threat of attack or takeover. This is basically admitted by the members of the Council for Foreign Relations. At a CFR event about fake news in 2018, CFR member Richard Stengel said the propaganda is actually fine and that it's normal for governments to use it against their populations. In addition to his role at the CFR, Stengel was also a member of the Obama administration as the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. He's a guy I wouldn't want to be under. And he's the former managing editor of Time magazine. He was also chief executive of the National Constitution Center. Listen to what he had to say about propaganda at this CFR event.
Every country creates their own narrative story. My old job at the State Department was what people used to joke as the chief propagandist job. We haven't talked about propaganda. Propaganda, I'm not against propaganda. Every country does it, and they have to do it to their own population, and I don't necessarily think it's that awful.
After he talked about how great propaganda was, a member of the audience asked him about the harmful impact that the propaganda of the CFR has had on countries outside of the U.S., especially in the global South. Stengel just said, "I hate last questions," and then thanked everyone for coming. Kind of sounds like there's a commotion in the audience after that. But the camera isn't facing that way, so I can't say for sure. What do you think? Maybe we should ask one of the members.
The gentleman right there, last question.
Understanding what happened in the world, because what is happening in America is what the United States flipped on the global South and in the third world, which we live with for many, many years in terms of a master narrative that was and still is propaganda.
You know what? I hate last questions. Don't you? I usually just want to end something before the last question. But at any rate, I want to thank this fantastic panel here today.
It's important to remember that the frustration that many of these other countries feel about their role in the global system is why they're forming agreements like BRICS against us. There have been a ton of major historical figures throughout time that were members of the CFR. But today, a large list of major politicians on both sides of the aisle and every major news organization is compromised by them. The list of current members is long, so I recommend that you take a look on your own, but I'll just name a few that you might recognize. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan. Lawrence Larry Fink of BlackRock. Eric Schmidt of Google. And you even have people like Anthony Scaramucci in there too. I heard he paid his way in. That's true. Of course, your boy Jerome Powell is a member of the CFR as well. The heads of financial agencies, and especially the Federal Reserve, are always connected to the Council of Foreign Relations. You'll also notice that those families I've been talking about, they appear many times on that list. Now, here's the thing though. Here's a question I have for you at the end. You'll also be surprised to see Jeffrey Epstein on that list. If you had any questions like, maybe that's a different Jeffrey Epstein. He has convicted sex offender in his bio. After his death, it came to light that he had made massive donations to the CFR, and it became a major controversy for the organization. They eventually donated the money to charities for trapped women, but this still exposed a very inconvenient connection for the CFR. And this is a question I have for you. Why was Jeffrey Epstein on the Council of Foreign Relations? That's something you need to think about. According to a report published last year by the University of Navarra, the Council on Foreign Relations is possibly the U.S. organization outside the U.S. government that has had the greatest influence on Washington's foreign policy. So I got an interesting challenge for you here. As you watch the news over the next few weeks and months, pay attention to the people whose opinions are being elevated when it comes to news and trends in finance and geopolitics, and check their names against the CFR membership list. You'll be surprised at what you find. That's all I got. Be blessed. BitBoy out.